kiddos. So welcome to our third installment of Kids Church. So we've made it to Jerusalem, right? We did Palm Sunday a little early last week for the grand processional. We're in Jerusalem. And now Jesus is in Jerusalem talking and teaching and doing various things. So there's several teachings on this. There's a couple of parables, some of which you would recognize from when we did parables and things like that. But I want to tell you two things that happen in Jerusalem, like actual events. Okay, so the very first one is right after what we stopped talking about last week, which was where Jesus was crying over the fact that nobody was believing him, right? That he was worried that so many Jews didn't know who he was and weren't accepting him as Messiah. So then he goes into the temple, right, which is kind of their church. This is a big deal. And when you go into the temple, at the time, they still did sacrifices, right? So if you guys remember anything about the Old Testament, you know that for the Day of Atonement and for various things, they actually sacrificed animals for their sins. This was the system for the Jewish religion. And so what happens when you go in, of course, there's going to be animals, right? Because people actually have to bring them in to sacrifice them. And it was hard because some people were coming from towns pretty far away. There was only one temple. This was in Jerusalem. It's not like, you know, how we have church in Albuquerque. And then when we lived in Colorado, there were like a bunch of churches there. And even if you lived in a different part of Albuquerque, you could go to a closer church. No, right? There's one temple in Jerusalem. So if you live in Bethlehem or you live in Nazareth or you live in, you know, any place other than Jerusalem, you have to come to the temple. So sometimes it was hard. If you were bringing animals with you to sacrifice, you have to bring them all the way there, which is kind of a pain, right? So a lot of times people wanted to buy animals in Jerusalem for the sacrifice. So what had happened was that the temple had grown up as a place where people could buy animals, which is so weird. We do not think of church as a place where you go and buy animals, right? Can you imagine walking into church and like Pastor Justin's like, here, would you like to buy a goat? And you'd be like, thanks, but no. But people actually did that because they wanted to have them for the sacrifices. The problem was, I'm sure you can imagine, it was a lot more expensive to buy animals at the temple, right? Because they were supposed to be perfect animals, without blemish, all that kind of stuff. So they'd have these very special, very perfect animals, right? And it was really hard to afford them. People were making a lot of money with these special, perfect animals that you could buy right at the temple when you really needed it, right? When you were right in an emergency. It was a limited market. And so it became really a problem for people who wanted to come and sacrifice. They couldn't afford to sacrifice, which is like saying you can't afford to be forgiven for your sins, which, as you can imagine, Jesus was not a fan of. So he does this. And he entered the temple and began to drive out those who sold, saying to them, "It is written, my house shall be a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of robbers." And actually, this is only Luke's version. There's a couple other versions in the other Gospels, and one of them, it actually says he has a whip. He's like really driving people out. Like, it was crazy, right? And this is right. I mean, people got mad about this. And all the other things he's about to say, this is part of why people got so mad and he was on the cross, right? Because they really didn't like what he did. He interfered with their livelihood. Why do you think that this of all things made Jesus so mad? Because you have to remember, we've seen him like all the stuff with the disciples, all these other things. And there were lots of people who had done bad things, like with Zacchaeus, he forgave him, all this kind of stuff. Why is this a thing that made him so mad that he was actually like physically like hitting people, getting them out of the temple? I mean, that's a big deal. We've not seen Jesus that mad yet, but this made him angry. And I think it's just because he didn't want anybody to feel like they couldn't come to God, right? We've seen all this, right? All the Pharisees and the Sadducees and all that, all the religious elite had all these rules that people had to follow. And when people didn't follow them, they talked about how bad they were. They were mad at Jesus for welcoming some of those people in. And Jesus kept consistently saying, all those people who want to be my people, I want them, regardless of who they are, who their status is, whether or not they're rich, whether or not they're important, whether or not they've been perfect. If they want to be my people and do what I say, then I want them to, right? So this is that, to Jesus, I think this was just the big total of that. Walking in, even into the temple, the place where everyone's supposed to be able to talk to God, and still there's this problem of us saying only certain people can. And so he gets really angry and he drives them out. And right after that, there's another story that also kind of involves money, which I think is really interesting. So to do that, I'm going to need Joaquin and Eliana's help. Come here, guys.
Yeah.
So I don't know what you guys have been doing during the social isolation, social distancing thing as you've been stuck in your house and have no school. We have been doing lots of different things. Some of it school, some of it art, some of it just sitting and watching TV, right? Which you guys would never do. But this Eliana has been doing. What are these, Eliana?
Melty beads.
Melty beads. So what do you do with melty beads?
You put them, it's hard to explain, but you can make them in a
There are
Like in a
little,
design?
there are little pegs. The beads have holes. You put the beads on the pegs to make a shape, and it's like in a square last.
And
You
then
can do little
Mm-hmm.
tiny beads.
And then you iron it, and then it
Parts of
comes
it.
out in it.
Yeah, and then you iron them together and they kind of melt together and they make like a picture or design or something. You guys might have used them. I don't know if you guys have ever crafted with this. So we were given this entire ginormous bin, okay? Because we bought somebody else's washer and dryer when we moved into our house. We bought it used. So we went to their house to go pick it up. Oh, yes, that's a craft one. And we got this entire bucket and it was mostly full, huh, Eliana?
Yeah.
So, but we have been making a giant picture because we have a lot of time. So we've used up quite a few. But this was mostly full. So I want you guys, if you look in the comments, like, you know how you can make comments on Facebook or on YouTube or whatever you're watching this on, I want you to tell me how many you think was in this jar. Have I rolled it around so they can see it enough? Did I see it? Do not rewind the video to go see. But guess how many beads you think were in this jar to begin with. Okay? So what is one bead out of this? Is this a lot of the jar? One bead out of a jar this size with this many thousands and thousands of beads in it? No, right? So numbers can kind of change depending on what it is. Now, how many houses does it take to make a lot of houses? One. Houses are a big thing. If you knew somebody who had more than one house, you would think they had a lot of houses, right?
Or they would be rich.
Or they'd be really rich, right? Even one house, you're like, well, that's a lot of houses. That's really all most people need, right? Is one. Some people don't even have one. They have apartments or things like that because they don't want to deal with one, okay? So one is a big number for houses. One is not a big number for beads, okay? Same sort of thing with ages, okay? So think about, first think about baby Arlo. Do you guys remember baby Arlo? He came and he was in our class for a while. Arlo was how old, guys?
Like 1.
He's 1, okay? So a whole year is just all of Arlo's life. To Arlo, a year is so long because that's his entire life. To Eliana, how old are you, babes?
8.
8. So a year is 1 out of 8 years. It's an eighth of your life, which is pretty substantial still. Does a year feel like a long time to you?
Nah.
Not too bad? Long but not
Not
awful?
when I'm doing school.
Not when you're doing school, only when you're home. Okay, Joaquin, how old are you?
4 years feels like a lot to me.
4 years feels like a lot too. How old are you?
13.
13. So a year in Joaquin's life feels like less than it does to Eliana, or feels like less than it does to Arlo. I will tell you, I am 39. I will be 40 this summer. By the time you see me, I might almost be 40. Oh, that's so
and
horrible.
also, when you're in school, you have your years counted away for you, so
That's
it feels
true.
like a year's longer.
It feels like it's long. But for me, a year does not feel long at all. It feels really quick because I've already lived 40 of them. So a year does not seem like a big part of my life. Okay. So that same idea is something we're going to take out into this next story that we're going to look at. Okay. So this is just a little bit farther in Luke. This is still part of while Jesus is in Jerusalem teaching and doing things right before he ends up going to the cross. So there we go. Oh, there we are. Okay. Chapter 21, in case you care. Jesus looked up and saw the rich putting their gifts into the offering box. And he saw a poor widow put in 2 small copper coins. And he said, truly, I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all of them. For they all contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, put in all that she had to live on. So what Jesus is saying is that those rich people that come in and they put in a bunch of money, right? They can afford to buy all the nice goats at the temple, even at the huge temple prices, or that put in a lot of money into the offering things, were like people who had a jar like this, and they gave God a couple beads. But that widow, when she comes in and puts in her 2 little pennies or her 2 little quarters or whatever it was, the equivalent in our money, that was all that she had. Okay. She was probably given very little stuff by like relatives or other people. And right then and there, that was the only money she had. And she gave it to God. And so God's saying, she had a house and she gave me the whole house. You had a box of beads. You gave me a couple of beads. And so Jesus tells us, and that story is put in the gospel so that we remember her, because he's saying that is her truly trusting in God and giving to God.
That might have been her food for the day.
I know, right? And she chooses to give it to God instead. And so what we see with that is that Jesus is trying to tell people how to do things differently, right? We don't make money off of people trying to know God, and we give to God, right? We are not taking money away from people trying to find faith and trying to do all that stuff. Instead, we are giving to God and trusting in him to do things. Our faith means more to us than our money, than our making of money, than all of those things. And if you think about it, to God, the entire world is just a few beads. He made the entire world. Who made the beads? Who made gold? Who made all of that stuff, right? So to a God who made the entire universe, doesn't matter how much we give, none of it is actually a lot because he has everything, right? It all seems pretty small potatoes. What he asks instead is for us to give ourselves, which is good news for you guys because you guys are kids. You don't have a ton of cash, right? All Jesus really wants from you is your obedience and your love, right? And in return, he promises to save us, remake the world, care about the widow's two mites, care about all the little kids coming to him,
Yeah.
right? So anyway, tell me your guesses on how many beads are in the thing. I've waved it around 1,000 times. You might be able to find it. On how many beads you've got. Also tell me anything fun you have been making during all this being at home, being alone. And goodbye. I'll see you next week.
Bye.